Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Thomas Jefferson, and the focus is the Sage of Monticello. The year is 1809, and Jefferson has just completed his 2 terms as President of the United States, and boy, was he ready to go home. He said at the time that never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power. Jefferson was ready to get back to Monticello, to his farm, his family, retire from politics, and for the most part, that's exactly what he did. He still maintained a correspondence with his successors, his good friends, James Madison and James Monroe. For the next 16 years, they occupied the executive mansion, but his letters were mostly about things like architecture and agriculture or some invention that he had just made, or maybe just about growing old. A lot more than anything about politics, which was not very often in his correspondence with his successors. Jefferson was very active in his post-presidential years. He was in his 60s at the time, but that didn't slow him down as he was up with the sun. He was in the saddle most of the day, riding around his estate, overseeing the activities on the farm, in the gardens, in his home as well. And he had a lot of people around in which to enjoy their company. That included his daughter Patsy, who was the only surviving daughter from his marriage to Martha Jefferson. Patsy had actually moved into Monticello in these final years of Jefferson's life, and she brought her 11 children with her. Patsy had married Thomas Randolph, who had become the governor of Virginia at one point, but she focused most of these years on Jefferson, helping him take care of the home, helping to take care of him, and giving Jefferson the opportunity to get to know and play with his grandchildren, which he reportedly did quite a bit in the big expanse of the yard, the grassy area behind the estate, and in the gardens, the sports and games, reportedly a happy part of Jefferson's retirement. Equally happy were many of the other visitors who came to Monticello to speak to the Sage of Monticello and the author of the Declaration of Independence and the founding father. Most of these were like-minded people, and so Jefferson embraced it, the opportunity to share common visions on what governments and politics and countries should be like, and he welcomed them into his home. It was pretty expensive, didn't seem to care. He broke bread, he gave them rooms to stay, welcomed them to stay for sometimes several days at a time. Lots of people in and out of Monticello during Jefferson's post-presidential years. But since he wasn't getting around very much, he rarely left the surrounding area. He had a very extensive correspondence, and the most noteworthy element to this was the rapprochement he finally had with John Adams. Jefferson and Adams had been as close as a pair could be when they were together as diplomats in France back in the 1780s. But they came back to the United States, they resumed their roles in the American government, and they became basically estranged. They were politically always very different, and even though they still had a personal bond, the political differences got so pronounced that it affected their personal relationship. Such that when Adams left his job as president and turned it over to Jefferson, the two had no contact with each other for nearly a decade, for more than a decade, in fact. That came to an end when a mutual friend by the name of Benjamin Rush, co-signer of the Declaration of Independence, tried to get them to start talking to each other again. And he encouraged both, and he got finally an inkling of a response from Adams in late 1811, when Adams said, "I always loved Jefferson and still love him." Well, Rush immediately shared that information with Jefferson, who responded, "This is enough for me. I only needed this knowledge to revive towards him all the affections of the most cordial moments of our lives." That underlying love and respect was finally going to get a chance to come out again. And it did beautifully over the course of 158 letters between Monticello and Adams' home that he called Peacefield. And well, they were mostly cordial letters. They were respectful. They talked about all kinds of interesting topics, again, science and architecture and things that meant something to them, again, including a lot of letters about the infirmaries of growing old, losing the ability to read, write, cite, and things like that. But they stayed away from the controversial topics for the most part. Adams was the one who was more likely to write. He wrote about 2/3 of the letters. He was also more likely to probe a little bit into some of their differences, but Jefferson rarely took the bait on that and tried to divert things into other topics. One area, though, of substance that Jefferson did opine on was a topic that had interested him his entire life, and that's the aristocracy. in particular the difference between the natural aristocracy, which is earned by the individual, and the artificial aristocracy, which is simply inherited by birth. In one of these letters in 1813, Jefferson wrote to Adams, "The natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and government of society. The artificial aristocracy is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy." This was part of Jefferson's view that really embodies the idea of the American dream, where there isn't some lid that's going to keep people down, and through their own good works, regardless of their circumstances of birth, they could rise up based on their own skills, their good works, perhaps some luck involved, but it wasn't an artificial constraint, and this is what he was expressing to Adams. Now, throughout Jefferson's retirement, throughout his entire life, Jefferson was served by slaves. He tended to call them servants, but they were slaves and they had no freedom amongst their own. And this, frankly, was one of those areas where Jefferson's philosophy and his reality were at odds. His words and his actions were not in sync. We go back to the 1780s when Jefferson wrote a book called The Notes on the State of Virginia, and he described early on his views about slavery when he said, "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances." Well, maybe Jefferson felt he was a prodigy over time because he certainly persisted in his habit of enslaving people to work for him, as he called, again, servants, but they were his slaves, really throughout his entire life. Jefferson also had an interesting take on the races between blacks and whites that he also wrote in the same book in the 1780s. Jefferson wrote, "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race, or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications." Now, a lot of people, certainly white people, had the same feeling, certainly at that time. Of course, Jefferson does stand out. After all, it was just a few years before when he wrote to all the world the phrase, "All men are created equal," but clearly he only meant white men. And blacks, as seen in this book, he believed were inferior in both body and mind, or at least this was his, quote, suspicion. Now, the challenge of slavery concerned Jefferson through most of his life. Again, he didn't really act on it, but he certainly expressed his concern on many occasions. And fast forward to 1820. The country's in a real bind right now, and their concern is about the expansion of slavery from the existing states into territories. In fact, the territories that were acquired by Jefferson as president with the Louisiana Purchase. There's all this land. It is ripe for agrarianism in many parts of the Louisiana Territory, and a lot of folks want to bring slavery into that area, and a lot of other folks were strongly against it. So they worked out a compromise. It was called the Missouri Compromise in 1820, and Jefferson said at the time, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, self-preservation in the other." In Jefferson's case, he chose self-preservation. In fact, that was something he did on more than one occasion. This is one of the areas where he and John Adams were quite different. When John Adams was weighing justice on one side, self-preservation or his own personal benefit on the other, he almost always chose justice. Jefferson was much more inclined to choose self-preservation. Part of this is reflected in the fact that Jefferson only freed 5 slaves at the time of his death. In his will, he actually had about 130 slaves at the time. Of the 5 that he freed, 2 of them were his own children. The question is, why didn't he free more, like George Washington did at his death? If he was so much in favor of this idea of getting rid of slavery, why didn't he free more? Well, the simple answer was he couldn't afford it. Jefferson was deep in debt at the time of his death, basically based on a lifetime of irresponsibly spending beyond his means. Jefferson was wealthy in land and slaves. He had major assets, but he was fundamentally cash poor. He never really generated an income throughout most of his life. And so when he was constantly buying things, whether it was books or materials, he always wanted the best from Europe, and certainly the building and rebuilding of his home at Monticello, which was never good enough, and there was no expense that he wouldn't care to pursue in terms of creating the perfect building. Jefferson just simply lived way beyond his personal means. And then things got worse for him. Late in life, he agreed to co-sign a note from a distant relative, Wilson Nicholas, to the tune of $21,000, and Nicholas defaulted. At this point, Jefferson simply had no chance to recover economically, and at his death, he only freed the 5 slaves. The rest were all sold. Many families were broken up, but also his property, Monticello, his dear Monticello, was also had to be sold because of this deep debt, largely based on his own overspending, which was a habit of his entire life. Now, Jefferson had one final major project. In 1819, at the age of 76, he decided to start a university and build it from scratch right down his mountain in the town of Charlottesville. And Jefferson did everything on this effort. He picked the spot, he designed the campus, he designed the buildings, he recruited the faculty, he worked the state legislature hard to get grants and approvals, he brought James Madison and James Monroe into this, and he was on site. He took that ride on his horse from the mountaintop of Monticello down into Charlottesville, the work site, almost every day. It was a few miles each way. Didn't matter to him. He was going to make that ride well into his 80s. This was so important to him. And an interesting element was very important to Jefferson, that there would be no religious affiliation with this university. There would be no church at the center of the University of Virginia. There would be a library for the diffusion of all knowledge, not constrained by any particular religious perspective. In October of 1825, less than a year before Jefferson's death, the university opened. He was its first rector. It was really a point of pride for Jefferson as the real founder of the University of Virginia, such that it made his epitaph. We had talked about in an earlier episode the first 2 items that Jefferson put in his handwritten epitaph, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the author of the Statute of Religious Freedom in the state of Virginia. Well, now he's got the 3rd, and that's the founding of the University of Virginia. That's what is on his gravestone. There is no reference to any political office on his epitaph. Near the end, it was time for Jefferson to say goodbye, and one of his last letters was to James Madison, his longtime compatriot for nearly 5 decades, like-minded, partners in most of their efforts politically. And Jefferson writes, "If ever the earth has beheld a system of administration conducted with a single and steadfast eye to the general interest and happiness of those committed to it, one which, protected by the truth, can never know reproach, it is that to which our lives have been devoted." Jefferson and Madison were as close as could be, personally and ideologically, whereas Jefferson and Adams were really tight personally, but really estranged politically. Jefferson and Madison didn't have that problem. They were like-minded throughout their career together, and this was one of his final letters of goodbye. He also wrote a letter of goodbye to the country. He was too ill to travel or too infirm to travel for the upcoming celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, but he did write, "The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. The American dream lived in Thomas Jefferson's mind." This was a big part of what he believed the legacy of the founding generation to be. As for Jefferson, he died on July 4th of 1826, the same day that John Adams passed away, 50 years to the day that they had both signed the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson as the author and Adams as the major catalyst in Congress. Really impossible to predict that such a thing could occur 50 years to the day, but that's what happened on July 4th, 1826. And as for Jefferson, well, his actions didn't always live up to his words, but his Republican vision, articulated by better than anyone in the founding generation, has certainly prevailed in the American mind. And that is Thomas Jefferson and the Sage of Monticello, from the life of Thomas Jefferson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.